What happens when a groom, overwhelmed by his own insecurities, slaps his bride in front of everyone at their wedding? It's the kind of moment that freezes time, where the music stops, the chatter dies, and every eye turns to witness something no one expected. That single act of violence wasn't just an outburst. It was a spark that ignited emotions, reactions, and consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. But this isn't just a story about anger or shame. It's about resilience, dignity, and how one person's choice can ripple through lives forever. The wedding was supposed to be perfect. Held in a grand hall with chandeliers casting soft light over rows of guests dressed in their finest, the day had started like any other celebration of love. The bride, Amina, wore a gown that shimmered as she walked down the aisle, her dark skin glowing under the warm lights. Her smile radiated joy, but there was also a quiet strength in her eyes, a strength born from years of overcoming challenges. She came from a modest background, raised by a single mother who worked tirelessly to give her daughter opportunities she never had herself. For Amina, this marriage wasn't just about love. It was about building a future where they could support each other equally. On the other side stood Daniel, the groom. To those who didn't know him well, he seemed confident, charismatic even. He came from a wealthy family, though not without its share of dysfunction. His parents' constant arguments growing up left him craving stability, yet unsure how to achieve it. On paper, Daniel and Amina were opposites. She grounded and resilient, he restless and insecure. Yet somehow, their differences complemented each other. At least, that's what they believed until now. Beneath Daniel's polished exterior lay deep-rooted fears of inadequacy, which often surfaced in moments of stress. And today, surrounded by hundreds of people watching his every move, those fears threatened to consume him. As the ceremony unfolded, everything appeared normal. At first, the vows were exchanged, heartfelt and sincere. Then came the rings, followed by the celebratory applause. But when the officiant announced them as husband and wife, something shifted. As Amina leaned in for the customary kiss, Daniel hesitated. His mind raced with doubts about whether he deserved her, whether others judged him for marrying someone so different from himself. In that split second, panic took hold. When Amina gently prompted him with a whispered, "It's okay," Daniel snapped. Without thinking, he raised his hand and struck her across the face. Gasps echoed through the room. The sound of flesh meeting flesh cut through the air like a knife. Amina staggered back, clutching her cheek, shock etched across her features. For a moment, silence reigned. Then whispers erupted, spreading like wildfire among the guests. Some looked away, unable to bear the sight. Others stared openly, horrified. Daniel froze, his hand still suspended mid-air, as if he couldn't believe what he'd done. The weight of his actions crashed down on him all at once, but it was too late. The damage was done. Amina didn't cry. Instead, she straightened her posture, her expression shifting from shock to resolve. Her voice rang out clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs. "Is this really who you are?" she asked, addressing Daniel directly. Her words weren't accusatory. They carried a calm authority that demanded an answer. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Shame burned in his chest, choking him. Around them, the crowd shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or let the couple handle it themselves. Then, something remarkable happened. Amina turned to face the audience. Her gaze swept over the sea of faces, lingering briefly on her mother, who sat near the front row, tears streaming down her cheeks. Taking a deep breath, Amina spoke again. "I'm sorry for disappointing anyone here today," she said, her tone measured but firm. "But I will not stand here and accept being treated this way. Not today, not ever." With that, she stepped away from Daniel, lifting the hem of her dress slightly as she made her way toward the exit. Her departure sent ripples through the room. Women began whispering encouragement, while men exchanged uneasy glances. One guest, a close friend of Amina's, stood up and followed her, offering silent support. Others hesitated, torn between propriety and instinct. Meanwhile, Daniel remained rooted to the spot, his world crumbling around him. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. Outside, Amina found herself in the cool evening air, her heart pounding but her mind surprisingly clear. She hadn't planned for this outcome, but neither did she regret her decision. As her friend joined her, wrapping a comforting arm around her shoulders, Amina allowed herself a small smile. "I'll be okay," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. And for the first time in hours, she actually believed it. As Amina stood outside, the cool breeze brushing against her face, she realized just how much clarity anger could bring. Her cheeks still stung from the slap, but it wasn't pain that consumed her. It was a strange sense of liberation. She had always been taught to value patience, to give people second chances, especially those you loved. But tonight something inside her snapped, not because Daniel hit her, but because he showed her who he truly was in front of everyone. And strangely, she felt grateful for it. Grateful that she didn't have to spend years wondering if she'd made the right choice. Her friend Sarah stayed close, murmuring words of support. "You did the right thing," Sarah said firmly, squeezing Amina's hand. "No one deserves to be treated like that, least of all on their wedding day." Amina nodded slowly, though her thoughts were racing. What would happen now? The guests were still inside, probably buzzing with gossip. Her mother would be heartbroken, not just for Amina, but for the wasted money, the ruined plans, the shame of it all. But none of that mattered as much as what Amina knew deep down. She couldn't stay with someone who let his insecurities turn into violence. Not even for love. Back inside the hall, chaos simmered beneath the surface. Some guests tried to act casual, sipping champagne and pretending nothing had happened, while others huddled together, whispering furiously. Daniel remained frozen near the altar, his face pale, his hands trembling. He wanted to run after Amina, to beg for forgiveness, but his legs refused to move. His best man approached cautiously, placing a hesitant hand on his shoulder. "Dude, you need to go talk to her," he urged, his voice low. "Before it's too late." But Daniel shook his head, guilt weighing him down like an anchor. "I can't," he muttered, almost choking on the words. "What am I supposed to say? That I'm sorry? That I didn't mean it?" His voice cracked, betraying the storm raging within him. "She'll never forgive me. No one will." His best man frowned, unsure how to respond. There was no playbook for this kind of disaster. All they could do was watch as Daniel sank into himself, his dreams of a perfect life crumbling faster than he could process. Meanwhile, outside, Amina took a seat on a nearby bench, staring up at the stars. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to breathe, to really think about what had happened. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about everything leading up to it. The subtle signs she'd ignored, the way Daniel would sometimes raise his voice during arguments, the way he'd dismiss her opinions when they didn't align with his own. She had convinced herself it wasn't a big deal, that everyone had flaws. But tonight proved otherwise. Love shouldn't hurt. It shouldn't make you question your worth or force you to tiptoe around someone else's fragile ego. Sarah sat beside her, silent but present. After a few minutes, she finally broke the quiet. "Do you want me to call your mom?" she asked gently. Amina hesitated before shaking her head. "Not yet," she replied. "I need to figure out what I'm going to say first." Sarah nodded understandingly, giving her space. They sat there for a while longer, the distant hum of music drifting through the open doors behind them. Inside, the party continued, albeit awkwardly, as if everyone was trying desperately to pretend the day hadn't gone off the rails. Eventually, Amina stood, smoothing out her dress. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside her. Sarah followed without question, grabbing Amina's purse and jacket along the way. As they walked toward the parking lot, Amina caught sight of Daniel standing near the entrance, his expression a mix of desperation and despair. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment she considered stopping. But then she remembered the sting of his hand against her cheek, the shock of betrayal, and she kept walking. Whatever apology he might offer wouldn't change what had already happened. The drive home was quiet, save for the soft hum of the car engine. Sarah glanced over occasionally, gauging Amina's mood, but didn't push her to talk. When they arrived at Amina's apartment, Sarah helped her gather a few essentials before leaving her alone to process. Alone in her small living room, Amina sank onto the couch, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. The reality of the situation began to sink in. Her wedding was over, her marriage cancelled before it even began. Yet instead of feeling devastated, she felt free. Free from the pressure to conform, free from the expectations of others, and most importantly, free from a relationship that clearly wasn't healthy. Over the next few days, the fallout spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with rumors and speculation, fueled by guests who couldn't resist sharing the dramatic story. Amina avoided it all, deleting her accounts and focusing on herself. Her mother called eventually, her voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, half scolding, half heartbroken. Amina explained as best she could, assuring her mom that she was okay, and more importantly, that she was safe. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Daniel, on the other hand, retreated into himself. He sent texts and left voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. "Please, Amina, let me explain," he pleaded in one message. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me." But Amina didn't respond. She knew apologies weren't enough, not without real change, not without accountability. So she blocked his number and focused on rebuilding her life. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Amina found her footing again. She threw herself into her work, reconnecting with old friends and rediscovering hobbies she'd neglected during the whirlwind of wedding planning. One evening, while attending a community event, she met someone new, a man named Marcus who shared her passion for art and literature. Unlike Daniel, Marcus listened when she spoke, respected her boundaries, and never made her feel small. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was a start, a reminder that happiness wasn't lost forever. As for Daniel, he spent months grappling with guilt and regret. He sought therapy, determined to understand why he'd acted the way he did and how he could prevent it from happening again. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was a necessary one. In time, he came to accept that some mistakes couldn't be undone, but they could serve as lessons for the future. In the end, Amina's decision to walk away wasn't just about leaving a toxic relationship. It was about reclaiming her power, about realizing that love should lift you up, not tear you down. And though the road ahead wasn't always smooth, she faced it with courage and grace, proof that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the brightest beginnings. Months passed, and life moved forward in ways Amina hadn't anticipated. The initial shock of the wedding day faded, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild herself, not just for others, but for her own peace of mind. She started journaling again, something she'd done as a teenager but abandoned during the chaos of adulthood. At first, it was messy, scribbled thoughts about anger, disappointment, and fear, but over time, her entries grew more reflective. Writing became her therapy, a way to untangle the emotions she couldn't always put into words. One night, she wrote, I thought I lost everything that day, but maybe I found myself instead. It wasn't poetic or profound, but it felt true. Her friendship with Marcus deepened slowly, without pressure or expectation. They met for coffee every few weeks, talking about books they'd read or places they wanted to visit. He never asked about Daniel, not directly, but when Amina finally opened up one rainy afternoon, he listened without judgment. "You're stronger than you think," he told her gently, his voice steady. "Not everyone would have walked away like you did." His words stayed with her long after their conversation ended, planting a seed of confidence she didn't realize she needed. Meanwhile, Daniel's journey was far less linear. Therapy helped him confront some hard truths about himself, the insecurities that had festered for years, the anger he'd buried so deeply he barely recognized it until it exploded. But understanding wasn't enough. Action was required. He began volunteering at a local shelter, not because he thought it would fix him, but because he wanted to channel his guilt into something productive. The work was humbling, serving meals, organizing donations, listening to stories of people who had endured far worse than he ever had. Slowly, he started seeing the world through different eyes. Compassion, he realized, wasn't just something you gave to others, it was something you learned to give yourself. Back in Amina's life, small victories began stacking up. She got promoted at work, thanks to a project she poured her heart into. Her boss called her into his office one Friday afternoon, beaming with pride. "You've earned this," he said, handing her the official letter. For the first time in months, Amina allowed herself to feel proud, not just of the promotion, but of how far she'd come since that chaotic wedding day. That evening, she celebrated with Sarah and a few close friends, laughing until her cheeks hurt. It wasn't perfect happiness, but it was real, and that made all the difference. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, lying awake in bed, Amina would wonder if she'd made the right choice. What if Daniel really had changed? What if walking away meant giving up on love entirely? These thoughts haunted her, but they no longer controlled her. Instead, she reminded herself of the truth. Love shouldn't leave bruises, whether physical or emotional. And while forgiveness might be possible someday, trust could only be rebuilt with time, and effort she wasn't sure Daniel was ready to give. One crisp autumn morning, Amina received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Daniel. Her stomach tightened as she held the envelope, debating whether to open it. Finally, curiosity won out. Inside was a handwritten note, simple and sincere. "Amina," it began, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you'll believe me when I say I'm trying to be better, for myself and for anyone else I might hurt in the future. Thank you for showing me what strength looks like. I'll always regret losing you, but I'll never stop being grateful for the lesson you taught me." Reading those words stirred conflicting emotions within her. Part of her wanted to dismiss the letter entirely, to throw it away and forget it ever existed. But another part of her felt relieved, not because she forgave him, but because it confirmed what she already knew. Daniel was taking responsibility for his actions. That alone was progress, even if it didn't change anything between them. She tucked the letter into a drawer, unsure what to do with it. Over the next few days, she found herself thinking about it often, especially during quiet moments at work or while sipping tea on her balcony. Eventually, she decided to write back, not to reconcile, but to acknowledge his effort. Her response was brief but thoughtful. "Thank you for reaching out. I'm glad to hear you're working on yourself. That takes courage, and I respect that. But please understand that my decision to walk away wasn't just about you. It was about me choosing a life where I feel safe and valued. I wish you nothing but growth and healing moving forward." Sending the letter felt like closing a chapter. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful reunion, just two people acknowledging their shared past while stepping towards separate futures. For Amina, it was freeing. She realized she didn't need closure from Daniel to move on. She already had it within herself. As winter approached, Amina noticed subtle shifts in her daily life. She laughed more easily, slept more soundly, and stopped second-guessing her decisions. When Marcus invited her to join him for a weekend trip to the mountains, she accepted without hesitation. Standing atop a snowy ridge, breathing in the crisp air, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was hers to shape however she chose. For Daniel, the road ahead remained uncertain. He continued attending therapy sessions, learning to navigate his emotions in healthier ways. The shelter became a sanctuary for him, a place where he could focus on helping others rather than dwelling on his mistakes. Occasionally, he wondered what Amina was doing, how she was feeling. But he resisted the urge to reach out again, knowing she deserved space to heal completely. Instead, he channeled his energy into becoming someone worthy of redemption, not for her sake, but for his own. In the end, both Amina and Daniel emerged from the wreckage of that fateful wedding day transformed. Neither of them returned to the lives they once knew, nor did they want to. Their paths diverged permanently, yet each carried lessons from their shared history. Amina learned the importance of self-respect and boundaries, while Daniel discovered the value of accountability and growth. Though their stories unfolded separately, they shared a common thread: resilience in the face of adversity. And perhaps that was the greatest takeaway of all, that sometimes the hardest moments in life reveal our true strength. Not everyone gets a happy ending, but everyone has the chance to create a meaningful one. For Amina, that meant embracing a future full of possibilities. For Daniel, it meant striving to become the person he wished he'd been all along. Both journeys were imperfect, but both were undeniably human. As the seasons changed, Amina found herself settling into a rhythm she hadn't known she needed. The mountains with Marcus had been refreshing, a chance to escape the noise of her thoughts and simply exist in the moment. They laughed over clumsy attempts at building a snowman, shared quiet conversations by the fireplace, and marveled at the vastness of the starry sky. It wasn't romance, not yet anyway, but it was connection, a reminder that relationships could be built on mutual respect rather than rushed declarations of love. When they returned home, their bond felt stronger, more grounded. For the first time in months, Amina allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to trust someone again. Marcus noticed the shift too. He didn't push for anything beyond friendship, sensing that Amina still needed time to heal. But he made small gestures that spoke volumes, leaving a book he thought she'd enjoy on her desk, inviting her to join him for weekend hikes, or simply checking in after a long day. These acts of kindness weren't flashy or dramatic, but they were consistent, and that mattered more than anything. Slowly, Amina began to let her guard down, realizing that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was courage. And Marcus? He proved himself patient enough to wait. Meanwhile, Daniel's transformation continued, though it came with its own set of challenges. There were days when old habits threatened to resurface, moments when frustration bubbled dangerously close to anger. But instead of lashing out, he turned to the tools he'd learned in therapy: deep breaths, journaling, even calling his therapist during particularly tough times. One evening, after a heated argument with a coworker left him seething, he sat alone in his apartment and wrote furiously in his notebook. "Why does this keep happening?" he scrawled, underlining the words until the pen nearly tore through the page. Then, beneath it, he added softly, because change takes time. It wasn't easy, but every step forward, even the smallest ones, felt like progress. At the shelter, Daniel found purpose in ways he never expected. He bonded with some of the regular volunteers, people who challenged him to see the world differently. One woman, an elderly volunteer named Ruth, became a kind of mentor to him. She had a no-nonsense way of speaking that cut straight to the heart of things. "You can't undo the past," she told him one afternoon as they sorted donations together. "But you can decide what you're going to do with it. Are you gonna wallow, or are you gonna grow?" Her words stuck with him, echoing in his mind whenever doubt crept in. By the end of the year, he started leading workshops for other volunteers, sharing strategies for managing stress and conflict. It wasn't about being an expert. It was about paying forward the lessons he'd learned. Back in Amina's life, her newfound confidence began spilling over into unexpected areas. At work, she took on leadership roles she'd once shied away from, mentoring younger colleagues and spearheading projects that pushed her out of her comfort zone. Her boss joked that she was becoming unstoppable, but Amina knew better. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving something to herself. Each success, no matter how small, reminded her of her worth. And while she still carried scars from the past, they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as reminders of how far she'd come. One spring evening, as cherry blossoms bloomed outside her window, Amina received another letter. This time, it wasn't from Daniel. It was from her mother. Written in her mom's careful handwriting, the note was filled with reflections on their family's journey and gratitude for Amina's strength. "I used to worry so much about protecting you," her mother admitted. "But now I see that you've always had everything you need inside you. You're braver than you know, my darling." Reading those words brought tears to Amina's eyes, not because they erased the pain of the past, but because they affirmed what she'd begun to believe about herself. That same week, Marcus invited her to dinner at a cozy little restaurant downtown. It wasn't extravagant, just candlelight, soft music, and plates of food they couldn't finish. As they talked, the conversation shifted naturally to deeper topics: hopes, fears, dreams for the future. For the first time, Amina opened up fully, sharing pieces of her story without holding back. Marcus listened intently, his expression thoughtful but never pitying. When the check arrived, he hesitated before speaking. "Amina," he said quietly, "I don't want to rush anything, but I care about you a lot. And if you're ready, maybe we could try taking this further." His voice wavered slightly, betraying his nerves, but his sincerity shone through. Amina smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I think I'd like that," she replied, surprising even herself with how certain she sounded. It wasn't a declaration of forever, but it was a start, a promise to explore what might lie ahead together. Walking home that night, hand in hand, she realized something important. Healing didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant choosing to move forward despite it. For Daniel, the turning point came later that summer. After months of volunteering and self-reflection, he decided to enroll in a community college program focused on counseling. It wasn't easy balancing classes with work and his commitments at the shelter, but he thrived on the challenge. Learning about psychology gave him new insights into his own behavior, helping him understand why he'd reacted the way he did on that fateful wedding day. More importantly, it reinforced his desire to help others avoid similar mistakes. By fall, Daniel stood in front of a classroom full of students, delivering a presentation on emotional regulation techniques. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, but his voice remained steady. "We all make choices we regret," he said, looking around the room. "But regret doesn't have to define us. What matters is what we do next." The applause that followed was modest but heartfelt, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of pride, not in who he used to be, but in who he was becoming. Though their paths remained separate, both Amina and Daniel carried the lessons of their shared history into their futures. Amina embraced love again, not because she needed it to complete her, but because she deserved it. Daniel dedicated himself to growth, not to erase his past, but to honor the person he wanted to become. Neither of them forgot the pain of that day, the slap heard by everyone, but they chose to let it shape them in positive ways. In the end, their stories weren't about perfection or happily ever afters. They were about resilience, accountability, and the power of choice. About finding light in the darkest moments and using it to guide the way forward. Because sometimes, the hardest decisions lead to the most beautiful beginnings. And isn't that what life is all about? As the years rolled on, Amina and Marcus's relationship blossomed into something neither of them had expected, but both deeply cherished. It wasn't perfect. There were disagreements, moments of doubt, and days when life felt overwhelming, but it was real. They learned to navigate challenges together, leaning on each other without losing themselves in the process. One evening, as they sat side by side on a park bench watching the sunset, Marcus turned to her with a question that caught her off guard. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if, things had gone differently?" His voice trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Amina paused, considering his words carefully before responding. "Sometimes," she admitted softly, "but not because I regret anything. I just wonder how different paths might have shaped me." She smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "What happened back then, it hurt, sure. But it also taught me so much about who I am and what I want. And honestly, I don't think I'd trade that for anything." Her answer seemed to satisfy Marcus, though he still looked thoughtful. "You're amazing, you know that," he said after a moment, nudging her shoulder playfully. Amina laughed, shaking her head. "Don't get all mushy on me now," she teased, but there was warmth in her tone. In that moment, surrounded by the golden hues of twilight, she realized something profound. Happiness didn't come from erasing the past. It came from embracing the journey, scars and all. Meanwhile, Daniel's life took on a rhythm of its own. The community college program led to an internship at a local counseling center, where he worked closely with families navigating conflict and trauma. At first, he doubted whether he belonged there, whether someone with his history could truly help others. But over time, he discovered that his experiences gave him a unique perspective, one that allowed him to connect with clients in meaningful ways. "You don't have to have everything figured out to make a difference," his supervisor once told him. Those words stuck with him, becoming a kind of mantra whenever self-doubt crept in. One particularly challenging case involved a young couple struggling with communication issues. As Daniel listened to their story, he couldn't help but see echoes of his own past, the unspoken fears, the misplaced anger, the missed opportunities for understanding. When the husband broke down during a session, confessing his guilt over hurting his wife, Daniel found himself speaking from the heart. "I know what it's like to lose control," he said quietly, surprising even himself. "And I know how hard it is to face the consequences. But here's the thing, wanting to change, that's the first step. Sticking with it, even when it's hard, that's where the real work begins." The couple left that day visibly moved, and Daniel felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced before. For so long, he'd carried shame like a weight around his neck. Now, he was using it, not to punish himself, but to guide others toward healing. It wasn't redemption in the traditional sense, but it was close enough. Back in Amina's world, milestones began stacking up in ways she never imagined. She and Marcus celebrated their first anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, laughing over old memories and dreaming about the future. By year 3, they were talking seriously about starting a family, though Amina approached the idea cautiously. Becoming a mother meant stepping into uncharted territory, and she wanted to be sure she was ready. "We'll figure it out together," Marcus assured her one night as they lay in bed, his arm draped protectively over her shoulder. "Just like we always do." When Amina finally held her newborn daughter in her arms for the first time, tears streaming down her face, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, for the life she'd built, for the love surrounding her, and for the strength she'd found within herself. Her mother, standing nearby with tears of her own, whispered, "You're going to be an incredible mom." Amina nodded, unable to speak through the lump in her throat. She knew parenting wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she had everything she needed to rise to the challenge. Daniel, too, reached milestones of his own. After years of dedication, he earned his certification as a counselor and opened a small practice focused on helping individuals and couples navigate difficult transitions. His office walls were adorned with quotes about resilience and growth, reminders of the lessons he'd learned along the way. Clients often remarked on his empathy, saying they felt seen and understood in ways they hadn't before. "It's not about fixing people," he explained during a community talk. "It's about giving them tools to fix themselves." Despite their separate lives, Amina and Daniel occasionally crossed paths, at charity events, mutual friends gatherings, or chance encounters in the city. Each meeting was brief but cordial, marked by polite smiles and nods of acknowledgement. There was no lingering resentment, no awkwardness, just two people who had grown beyond the pain they once shared. Once, at a holiday party hosted by a mutual acquaintance, they found themselves standing near each other while chatting with different groups. Catching his eye across the room, Amina offered a small smile, a gesture of peace more than anything else. Daniel returned it, nodding slightly before turning back to his conversation. It was a fleeting moment, but it carried weight. In the end, their stories weren't defined by the slap that changed everything, or even by the choices that followed. They were defined by the courage it took to rebuild, to grow, and to choose hope over despair. Amina became a beacon of strength for those around her, proving that resilience wasn't about avoiding pain but about rising above it. Daniel transformed his regret into purpose, showing that accountability could lead to redemption. Together, though apart, they embodied the power of second chances, not just for others, but for themselves. And perhaps that was the most beautiful part of it all. Life doesn't always give us happy endings, but it does give us opportunities to learn, to heal, to become better versions of ourselves. For Amina and Daniel, those opportunities came wrapped in hardship, but they seized them anyway. Because sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the brightest destinations. And isn't that worth celebrating?